Eric, you know, controversy, we need another word other than controversy for what happens to iron culture. We have a lot of haters. Let's just come right out and say it. We have a lot of haters because when you're at the top, as we know, it gets lonely. You have a lot of enemies. Everyone wants your financial wealth. We know that the sole function of any individual in a capitalist society is to accrue wealth. And so because we have the clout, they're coming at the Kangs and they're trying to assassinate us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just when you make the deal with the devil, and the devil being success, and the deal being us and being the most successful,
right.
This is just something you accept, that you will, of course, receive the accolades, the glory, which we definitely did not trade our passion for. We never would. But what we absolutely did trade was the respect of haters. And, I think the one way to look at it is that, are you really successful if you don't have haters? Because as we know, haters go and hate. And if they're not hating you, it's because you're not successful.
Yeah.
So I think probably a better metric for success than actual success, because we haven't had a whole lot of that, is how much hate do you have? So, I look at us and I go, hey, we haven't achieved most of our milestones that we set, both becoming millionaires from iron culture,
Right.
both using the knowledge of our guests to become world champions in multiple sports. That didn't work out. Both achieving body recomposition to where we're walking around in stage condition while gaining muscle, also avoiding eating disorders. We've had guests on to help us with that. We've had all these guests on. None of our plans happened, but in the process, we've achieved a lot of hate. So I look at that. Some might call this rationalizing. They might say, hey, you failed at every goal you set forth and everyone hates you. How could you see this as a win?
Right.
And I say, how could you not see this as a win? We have so many haters, therefore success.
I can't argue with that. I mean, we do have a monster episode today, and no, it's a duo episode, not because we couldn't get a guest. It's because we didn't want a guest. We're talking about individual differences. And what does that even mean? Where people will often hear, it depends. Well, it depends on what. And there's going to be a lot of nuggets before we get started, because we have our hungry listeners, the faithful, the Iron Cult. There's just a few things to go over. So first, Eric, we had that Highland Games episode, was well received. Someone said it was a badass episode. Someone said, Kevin Richmond said Sean Connery is in fact Scottish, Omar, which it's crazy how this shit works. Eric, we understand technology, the airwaves. He heard me say he's Welsh when clearly you heard me when I said Sean Connery, he's Scottish. And it's weird what happens with the sound engineer. So I understand how there's kind of a loss in translation moment there.
Yeah.
But we're never wrong. So that's an easy one. There is one before we go on, and we'll get to kind of the pyramid battle. We'll update everyone on our lawsuit. That's next. But someone said, Eric, and I want you to absolve me of this accusation.
Okay.
And someone said, last episode, as you know, like I mentioned, when Kyle Lilly was there, we're talking Highland Games. And I have put forth that we've known each other a lot longer than you remember. You have claimed that, in fact, our first time that we met in person was 2018. And I said that's technically true if we define meeting as in a physical interaction that two people remember. Okay. But last episode, I stated once again that I was there at the 2011 victory, your victory, competing in bodybuilding. And so this guy, Ishank, said in this episode, Omar lies for the 86th time about being present during the infamous 2011 victory of Eric. And of course, Iron Culture, which we have a very real virtual assistant. It's not one of us responding to people directly on our YouTube channel. Said, we've been informed by Omar's very real lawyers that this is slander. And in fact, he was most definitely spiritually and emotionally there during Eric's 2011 victory. So brother, I never want any controversy with you. We're united together. We see a standard, two serpents, okay? Conan the Barbarian style. We're ruling, our masculinity in crisis tour, the become alpha, out alpha everyone together. So can you just let them know what happened in 2011 so we could just move past this and I could stop bringing it up, because it just seems like every time I bring it up, I don't want to say miscommunication, but I feel like something gets lost in the shuffle. Yeah.
So remember how when Bob Bell was on, you put me in a position where I had to either put my integrity or our friendship first with that hypothetical of would I give you a placing in a bodybuilding competition you didn't deserve?
That I didn't deserve. Yep.
Um, that didn't go well for you.
Hmm.
And I don't know why you're trying to do that again when you know it won't go well for you, but I'm going to do my best here. I'm going to give
Yeah.
you one of two, and you get to choose which. So I
Choose your own
remember when you
adventure.
said, yes, this is choose your own adventure. Um, I remember when you said that Sean Connery was a Welshman. Um, I, for a moment, thought, oh, he must know something I don't. Omar's very cultured. He talks about jazz, you know, uh, and that's pretty much the metric. And I mean that and drinking kombucha. But after that, I think jazz is probably a solid second. So we can either go with it was an error that you stated he was a Welshman, but you actually were wrong and that he was Scottish, or we can go with the possibility that maybe you were there in 2011. I was just not aware.
Yeah.
Choose your own
Yes.
adventure, buddy.
Yeah, definitely. So 2011, I'm tripling down on that one. I was
Mm,
there. We needed to find, and I suppose that's more a philosophical question. What does it mean to be there, right? What is there in the
right.
first place? And being, what is being? Of being in nothingness, right? What are we really talking about here? So there's a lot to unpack there. We don't need to unpack that right now, Eric. It's good to know that you gave me, as you said, a choice, and we're in both of us are in agreement that there was the possibility. You think there's a possibility. I know it's a factual, in reality situation that happened that's in my memory, burned, etched in my
So
mind.
you know what's so those who are young, they're not going to be aware of the Choose Your Own Adventure books. Um,
So good.
they were, I mean, they were like the whatever the latest console that comes out for books. Think of it that way. Okay, it's like
Yeah.
the PS insert recent number of books. Okay, so you flip to a page and it gives you two options, and you choose one of them, and then it tells you what page to go to. What Omar did is he got to that page. There's two
Yeah.
choices,
Yeah.
and he closed the book and walked away. And that's just basically what happened on air.
Yeah.
So I guess there is always a third choice, and I
Whew.
commend you for taking the path less traveled.
Eric, my friend. So this is relevant to the pyramid battle now. Thank you.
Mm,
I heard exactly what I wanted to hear. And that is sometimes when presented with a problem, there is a unique solution, such as in Star Trek, the Kobayashi Maru that
yep.
Kirk pulls off, right? Or, which is definitely inspired by Alexander the Great, the likely apocryphal, but let's go with it, tale of the Gordian knot, where there's a knot that no one could unravel. And when he stood there and it said whoever would unravel this knot would be king of essentially the land, and he just sliced it with his sword, boom, unraveled it. There we go. That's the solution. We're talking now ancient history. And for those that are very curious, we actually have 90% of our listeners are more audio. So they're just on, either Spotify, they're on iTunes, they're on other platforms other than YouTube. So I just want to describe the picture in the background of what's going on, Eric, because we're taking the fight to them. Okay, we're
Mm,
not gonna. We need the best defense is a good offense. We know this. And so we had in the previous episode, I traveled to Egypt, and that's why we're at the pyramids of Giza. We were
hmm
doing the episode. It was fantastic. Everyone loved it. They wondered how I was able to travel. It's a long story. It's called being shipped in cargo. Now I'm standing. Actually, we're going even further back because I've been told that now there are not only pyramids, Eric. There are step pyramids. Okay, known as ziggurats, ancient Sumerian structures. And so I'm actually currently right now reporting to you live from the ziggurat at Ur, which is not the oldest one. There's the Anu, as we know, ziggurat, which started. It's a
hmm
step pyramid, and that's about what 4,500 BC. And so that's a long time ago. So we thought that our lawsuit would stop essentially at the pyramids because everyone knows the Great Pyramids. Sure, whatever. Like they're coming at Eric. They're saying, "Hey, stop using the muscle and strength pyramids. You can't use the word pyramids. We were here first." And we said, because we sold our souls to Paimon, we've been here forever, and there's no
mm.
concept of time. We've transcended above and beyond time, mere mortals. Um, and so they try to essentially do what he did to Osiris to us. Now we know it goes back further, Eric. We're
Yep.
here at the ziggurats, and we're refusing to back down. And these might be funky pyramids where there's steps to them, and they might predate now the Great Pyramids, but we're not about to back down to the Babylonians.
I mean, essentially, this comes down to good faith actors, right? If I make a claim, I was the first one to come up with the term, concept, image of a pyramid. Egypt comes around and says, "Hey, we were the first ones," and then literally thousands of years before that, around 2,000 years prior, there was an existing pyramid. Can you trust Egypt? No.
Yeah.
And I was recently looking at copyright law, international copyright law. And by recently looking at international copyright law, I mean changing the narrative to fit my argument. I noticed that they do expire. I don't know the exact date. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm sure a lawyer would absolutely back up everything I said as fact. But look, if Egypt had a claim from around 2,000 years ago, and it was predated by one 4,000 years ago, which I would think surely has expired, and we have the Mayan clock resetting in 2012, the same year which I released the pyramid videos, and I did file for a copyright. I think we
this
can
is all
state
true,
one.
folks.
This is nothing is false that I'm saying except for the false parts. It actually is true that the videos came out in 2012. I think we can state a number of things. First, false claim by Egypt, predated. Go look north at Iraq, folks. Okay, Mesopotamia. They were the ones who did it first. They don't seem to have an issue with it. I think they appreciate and respect what I've done. And they understand that it's a distinctly different type of pyramid. Like you said, they're a little funky. Not the same. So I think I can absolutely lay claim to being the first on the Mayan clock. And they know a little something about pyramids too. So let's not. If you want to disparage Mayan culture, you're barking up the wrong pyramid, if you will. So I don't know. I just don't feel like there's any case for Egypt now. And again, I just want to reiterate, everyone who's listening, you're missing the Easter eggs of our backgrounds that we have had on YouTube. So, you can listen to us, but I know most people are listening because they don't want to be distracted by the handsomeness of Omar Isuf, that caramel goodness, his beautifully manicured facial hair, and not to mention the excellent headbands that you wear, the great shirts that you have. Shout out Rascal Apparel. So I understand. You don't want to be distracted, but just know that your choice to not be distracted by Omar's attractiveness is also having you miss out on the Easter eggs of the visual aids that we have really for these episodes.
So Eric, we're going to get to the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of this episode, because I could totally go off on a tangent and give you compliments right back at you, but I think it would constitute potentially harassment with how in-depth and in detail I'd go in the glowing reviews of you. I did read, and we'll talk about that in another episode or maybe off air, about the 3DMJ client guidelines, where there's like number 3, no romantic involvement with clients and all those things. So all I'll say is clearly whoever has you is a lucky individual. And there's many people that would appreciate you. And that's all I'll say, because again, I'm not out here wanting to get sued or terminated by you as my coach. So I'll sidestep. I'll kind of just sidestep that one right there and say right back at you, and say, hey, we've settled we've conquered all haters. We cut the Gordian knot. Kobayashi Maru, get out of here. We're talking today about the nitty gritty things that are actually relevant to you, and that is, people often hear, Eric, individual differences. Okay, so you have the program. Listen, Eric, you can't do the template. Here's why you can't do the template. You are not a number. You are a person. You are an individual. And thus you need to customize things for you. And we often hear at the same time, and I don't want to say it makes people irate when they hear it, but you want to know how things are relevant to you personally, right? You don't want to hear like, well, in a study, like here was like the mean, here's what happened on average, and went up. It's like, yeah, but how's it relevant to me? And often, because scientists want to be very clear with what they say, they'll say either it depends, or they'll try and give context that then you realize what they're talking about doesn't neatly and perfectly describe you. And so there is a little bit of that gap that exists between not the research, but what's being said and then how it applies to an individual. And someone that's looking to uncover all those rocks that they totally will not use to build a pyramid, because trust me, you don't want any of the smoke that we got. They're trying to optimize their body composition, their strength, all these little factors. And so I'll just give you a few examples before we unravel it. But like sometimes you have some reactionary either articles or blogs or videos, or just a reflection on certain things where I think Greg Knuckles, to give a shout out to Stronger by Science and the Nux. I've always loved the Nux, the content he puts out, to be serious for a second. He had, because it was like a dirty exercise regarding the strength community. Remember that trap bar deadlifts? Where people were like strength coaches, Eric would be like, "Oh, trap bar deadlifts." Like, "Oh, you're gonna do trap bar deadlifts? You're what? To be a man and just conventional deadlift?" And he's like, "But is it though? Like, is it such a bad thing?" And so when it comes time to trying to choose the right exercises, the right training program, the right macro split, there are a lot of considerations. So I want to open up this can of worms. Individual differences. What does that actually mean? And how can someone listening to this, besides pulling a Thomas Edison, when really they should be pulling a Nikola Tesla, which is like just trial and error until it's like, well, it's 20 years later. I've tried 1,000 different things. I'm not the best at evaluating my own results. I don't know what's going on. Can we define what individual differences mean? And how do we navigate this sticky world in order to get the best results for ourselves?
What an intro. And folks, now that we're 15 minutes into the podcast, we're ready to have it. We've listen, we appreciate foreplay, and so should you. That's all I got to say.
Right.
So I think you framed that really well. And man, I like how you included science, because one of the problems we have in the evidence-based community, which, really doesn't mean anything. Normally that's people who are interested in science. Really what it should mean, there's the scientific community, and there's people who are practitioners who are using that as part of their calculus to decide what to do with their clients. In that community, because we do rely heavily on scientific evidence, we often fall into some mental traps of misinterpreting science as a whole. So science, when using like frequentist statistics, that's when we're actually comparing things and reporting a p-value and saying whether or not there's a difference between two groups. It's really all about assessing differences that are quote unquote real or significant between means, right? So the underpinning thing that we're doing is assessing means, the averages of groups. And the whole reason why we say things about samples, like, oh, we need a larger sample size, or, oh, we've got type 1 or type 2 error here, and we got to make sure that we account for sampling variance and get enough people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The reason why we care about getting a large enough sample is it's meant to be representative of the population they came from, so that when we then use a study with a sufficient sample size and we find a statistically significant difference between the two means after an intervention, then we can make a generalization about a population. So if you're not aware of that, and if you don't understand that that is a core fundamental aspect of most of the statistics and designs used in our field of exercise science, and most fields in health and fitness for that matter, you are prone to make errors when you not interpreting the research, but applying the research. So if you are always seeing differences between means, saying this is greater than that, this was better than that, this produced greater strength or greater hypertrophy, it is an easy thing to confuse those mean responses with individual responses. To think that, hey, this study showed that a undulating periodization model is better than a linear one, therefore I should do that with Joe or Susie. And that's not the way research should be used. So the reason why I didn't want to say evidence-based community is because what evidence-based truly means, and we've talked about this on Iron Culture before, is basically having these three pillars to a framework of working with people in a service-based industry, like being a trainer. And it is one pillar is scientific evidence. Another pillar is your experiences. And we've talked a little bit about what it means to be an expert, what it means to accumulate experience, what it means to pay attention, and how anecdote can be a useful piece of your decision-making process. And I'll clarify that in a little bit. And then finally, individual preferences, and I would argue individual differences. Those are the three pillars to evidence-based practice. So the error is when you only use science and you think that it tells you what to do with individuals. And this actually leads us to the, like, if you take that logical inference all the way out, it basically says that if we can recruit large enough samples, so we have confidence in our findings, we can find the one best program and the one best solution to every problem. But that is actually not true. Even if we threw $3 billion at bodybuilding and powerlifting research, we would simply know what was the on average best for everybody, which would probably be a mediocre program for the individual. And you're saying, what? How could that be? Well, here's an interesting statistical fact about frequentist statistics. And we don't have this problem in exercise science. It's actually something you see sometimes more in medical research, that anytime sample size increases to a point, the smallest differences all of a sudden become significant. So like if I want to find the difference between two groups of 8 people, there needs to be a pretty homogeneous and large difference between the groups relatively in terms of eight person sample size studies for that to be significant when I run statistics on it. However, if I run a 3,000 person RCT, and this I'll use a different example that's not in exercise science because it probably wouldn't be possible, and I'm comparing a drug and a placebo, right? And the drug has a very minor effect. Let's say it's for diabetes, and it very minorly lowers blood glucose, maybe a couple points for the average person. That would be significant, but its effect size would be in the category of what we might consider trivial. It wouldn't have any clinical impact. It works, it just doesn't matter, you know? And that's not necessarily useful. That's a great example of, hey, we can find a drug that does something, but it's really not a good drug. It's just reliably not that powerful, you know? Like, yes, if I take a shot glass and I fill it with water and I throw it into the ocean does have more water, but it doesn't matter. So I think that is why we can't just rely on scientific evidence. Now, that said, not all science is purely based on trying to teach you about group means. There's a classic study by Hubble and colleagues back in 2005. And Hubble, really, really classic study, great study. And what they did was they didn't just report the means and the differences between groups, but they reported the range of outcomes. And this was, I think, close to 300 people, if I remember the sample size properly. And what they did was they had them train for 12 weeks, and they recorded changes in strength. Probably the most relevant for our listeners is a 1RM bicep curl. They didn't actually use like a dumbbell or barbell or anything like that. They used an isokinetic dynamometer. So I should probably say maximal strength on an isokinetic dynamometer, if I recall correctly. And I may be misremembering. I think it was an ISO. But the point is they measured 1RM strength, and they also measured change in cross-sectional area. And the changes ranged from 0 to plus 250% in the 1RM in a 12-week period, and from 0 to right around plus 60% in cross-sectional area. So, I mean, some people train for 12 weeks, nothing happened. And they weren't necessarily the same people who, you know, if you gain strength doesn't mean you didn't gain size. There wasn't a strong relationship there either. It was also men and women. And interestingly enough, there weren't really big sex differences, if any at all. Meaning that, yes, a woman's absolute size might be less, but the relative change to her base is going to be quite similar to men. So the point being is that you're sampling from that population. You know, most of the studies we got, like I said, are like 8 to 12, maybe 20 people per group. This was a 300-person study, and it found the range of responses was huge. Now, if you just looked at the means and you didn't consider what that standard deviation meant, you would very easily take the wrong outcome from that. You know, but what it really is telling you is that, hey, there's a huge variation in individual response to training. There's a lot of variables that impact it. And that means that those two other pillars of evidence-based practice, your experience, seeing, okay, how do I apply these principles in this situation, in this situation, in this situation, and you build that catalog of pattern recognition along with the individual differences, your communication with the person, what they put in their intake forms, what they tell you, their injury history, what they've observed on their own before they came to you, what they like and what they don't like, and where their motivations might lie, what their schedule is. All of these things together is going to be able to account for far more of the potential individual differences in the variables that might change them.
I knew this was going to be a monster episode. When Eric gets started, boy, look out. I want to, Eric, just quickly come in defense of the science, so to speak, because, you know, when people, sometimes you want to distill a message down to a neat little soundbite. And so initially people say, okay, like means, not really relevant to us. It's like we're spending all this time and research to do these things, and yet it's not directly applicable to the average trainee. It's like, see, I told you, it's like these nerdy ass scientists are just conducting these studies, and they don't realize all you need to do is train hard and eat like your protein, and away you go. It's like, I think that's a way too a reductionist of line of thinking. I think actually, personally, I could say, being now speaking more low to the ground, observing kind of the trends, seeing what happens in gyms, in the online community as well. I'd say most of the seismic shifts that have occurred over the last 10 years were started in the scientific community, and then it trickled down. And I'll just give a few quick examples before we go on, and we really dive into the individual differences and how to make some of that pattern recognition work. I would say first, if we look at the landscape about 10 years ago, I remember when I was first deadlifting either in public facilities or then talking about it, there was a lot of old adages that simply weren't true. So there was almost superstition that was ruling the airwaves, so to speak. And what I mean when I say that is that when you're kind of low to the ground and you're not really sure what's working, you're trying to observe, but you're using your five senses, and that's all that you have. And you have a very small sample size. So as a coach, as an individual, and sometimes you misapply or misattribute what is happening and the reason behind that. And so they might see, as an example, like I was told by an old head at the gym, this is now like 10 years ago, over 10 years ago when I first started lifting, like, oh, this deadlift's like, man, it's like, that's that's not really going to build the muscle, like lead to cellular swelling. What you're doing there is like, what you want to engorge the muscle with blood, right? And these are very common things that you're told as a lifter all that time ago. Same idea. So like, let's say this guy's shredded, right? Like, so there was a guy who was at the University of Windsor and his nickname was the Gladiator. Now I know, because I was actually late to the party, Eric, when it came to like knowing, learning about steroids or just how prevalent and ubiquitous they are. Not accusing him at all. I don't know. It's that. Let me just say, like, even now, if I was to see the guy like this is a yarnked guy. Like, this guy's yacked out of his mind. Okay. But again, it's like, all right, biggest guy in the room. Out of curiosity, is like he simplified his food choices once again to a point that is needlessly almost obsessive in terms of the food selection. And so when you have this level of superstition where, because they're not quite sure what actually is working, so it goes calories, it goes the macronutrients, the protein requirements, all that sort of stuff that we've already covered on our own culture, you simply don't know. And so you're almost trying to navigate in the darkness, to use the Mike T example, and your flashlight, like your direction, your feedback, it's almost like you have mirrors instead of having just a pure flashlight that's either guiding you in the darkness, where you're seeing all these faulty signals. And so you're trying to make the best choices with what you have, but your method of evaluating it might not be best. And so years later, when things such as, from the community, such as calories being of prime importance, the overstatement of certain things being more important than they actually were, or the idea that for natural athletes, the progressive overload or combining, let's say, strength movements or focusing on getting progressively stronger is actually pretty important for someone that wants to get bigger, was a seismic shift in the community. And that all kind of was predated by the scientific community, and then the communicators learning to apply that, coaches, individuals like Mike T, yourself, changing the landscape. And I would say, lastly, just before we go on, if we use the IPF, which is like the testing ground, Eric, for some of these ideas, and we see how lifters lift, I could tell you from 2012 in powerlifting circles, the way that individuals trained compared to now, it's very different. I would say it's largely better. Like, just kind of, there's like best practices, but a lot of those things, like I'm thinking now, just real quick. I'm thinking for some reason of Mike Z's Mike Zordos, his power study, where he's talking about those things are like periodization or different models. Just the influence of all these things that then trickle down to the community. People realize, hey, this, like, I don't need to do these things. I don't need to be needlessly restrictive. It's okay for me to do this. Or like, as an example, when it comes to strength training, like, hey, singles, like throwing in singles pretty frequently, that's a good idea. What a change it's been. So in defense quickly of the scientific community, or doing this research, and even if it doesn't apply in quotations to the individual, how it really pushes the ball forward. That's all I wanted to say, because I know there are some people, if you just listen to that segment, it's like, oh, Eric just said that. Yes, that's what I thought. Here we go. It's like, and they're not listening to the whole thing. So, my man, continue. I'm all ears.
Now, that would also be a very impressive maintenance of confirmation bias too. Like,
Right.
if you sat here and listened to a statistically driven scientific explanation of how science is misapplied from a scientist, and your take home is, see, I knew science would prove that science doesn't work, then then just well done, because that's a level of cognitive dissonance that I think most people would struggle to maintain. Um, yeah, so yeah, but fantastic. You can go on your Instagram now and you could say science proves science doesn't work, and if you don't see an issue with that, then good on you. Carry on, you know. So yeah, I know. I think that was a really good point, and I think it also is a nice segue for us to understand what science is for. And because it's about group means and it's about what seems to work on average, but reliably on average and significantly, if we want to use the proper terminology, then it helps us make broad sweeping statements. It helps us get in the right ballpark. Because, like you said, if you are completely misinformed, if you are dealing with correlates instead of things that are causational, like, in the process of training hard, training more or less progressively, doing sufficient volume, and taking copious amounts of anabolic steroids, I've noticed I get a pump, and I think that's what's causing it. But it might be the other things I mentioned on the way to the pump. And I'm a big fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger and pumping iron and some other people who also promote that. That can easily lead to a system where you're focusing on the pump at the at a higher level than variables that are much more related to what you're trying to achieve, like seeing continuous progressive overload in the rep ranges you're training in, for example. So yeah, I think science is really useful in that example as to telling us what direction we should be in, and what broad sweeping strokes we should start with. I like to say, like, hey, if as an analogy, like if you were going to paint a room, you are going to have to do like the trimmings, the edges. You're going to have to be very careful. You'll need the painter's tape. You don't want to get paint on your windowsill, which is a different material, metal. It'll look gnarly. You're not going to want to get paint on your carpet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're just dealing with the big wall, yeah, you just slop it on there, and the painter's probably going, no, you don't just slop it on there, Eric. But I think you get my point. You can use broad brushstrokes. You can really just kind of put it on there thick, but it's not the detail work. I like to think of there's like a baton handoff between science and anecdote and personal experience. So, for example, if you are using the highest quality evidence, meta-analyses, which are a collection of all the RCTs on the topic, that if done properly, which is not a guarantee, unfortunately, tell you a really good idea with the largest sample size possible, because they've collected a bunch of RCTs. What do we know about these broad strokes, about the population of people who lift weights? We go, okay, well, we'll probably want to start training each muscle group at least twice per week. We'll probably want to start with roughly around like 10 sets per muscle group, maybe 8, maybe 12, somewhere in there. And, we're probably going to want to train in a rep range that's, more than 5, but probably somewhere less than 20, because that just gets silly for certain exercises or needlessly fatiguing. And then we go from there. What exercises should I use? Well, we know enough about biomechanics, and we're going to choose an upper body push, vertically, horizontally, upper body pull, vertically, horizontally. We'll get a hip hinge movement in there. We'll get a squat pattern, and then we'll throw in some isolation work for some movements that we know as best as we can aren't well trained by these compounds. We'll get some rear delt work in. We'll get some hamstring curls. We'll get some calf raises. Sorry, Omar. So all of that together, and that's where you start. But then that's where science ends, quite literally. And unless you're using a different type of science, for example, a case study of someone very similar to who you're working with, where you think there might be enough overlap to where you can observe, hey, what did they do? They did all these athlete monitoring things, only an N of 1. That means we can't extrapolate it to the population. There might have been real changes, relative to baseline in this individual, and there's stats for that in the case series or case study model. But it doesn't tell us anything about anyone except that person. Well, is that person similar to who I'm working with? If I'm reading a case study of 2 high-level weightlifters, which I just covered in last month's issue of Mass, well, actually, when this comes out, it'll be two issues ago. But anyway, recently in Mass, I covered a case study of 2 national-level weightlifters in the U.S. That's not something you can extrapolate to anyone who wants to become a weightlifter. But if you're working with high-level weightlifters at the national level of a similar weight class with similar lifts over a similar time frame, that might be useful information, And I think that's an example of where there's a little more similarity to what we do with experience to what we do with science. So when we can't prove causation in science, it goes down that evidential hierarchy. I started with a meta-analysis saying, hey, here's those big, broad brushstrokes. Below the meta-analysis are the RCTs that it consists of. Below that are non-causational designs. Once we get below controlled trials, now we're looking at basically really high-quality observations. The difference between an anecdote where, Omar, you go, in my years of training, my years of being a strength journalist, my years of training myself and being a trainer, these are the trends I observed. That's good, because you have a lot of experience. You're relatively rational. You have enough of a scientific background. I'd say you have a pretty high quality anecdote, but it can only get up so high on that pyramid. And the only difference between your anecdotes and, let's say, a case study is if a bunch of scientists got together with coaches and said, you know what, let's actually quantify all these different things every week, track this variable, track that variable, track this variable, and see what is the normal variation in this person's performance, muscle size, jump height, all these variables, right? And then we'll see, do they change outside of that normal biological and measurement variability over time? And we can't say that was the best program, but we can absolutely say it did or didn't work. And that's kind of basically what you want to try to emulate in your personal practice. You need to have metrics to track, is what you're doing working? And to quote Dan John, who we had on way back in the day, along with Susie and Matt Gary, great coaches who've been in the game a long time. A quote from Dan John is that if you got better, I'm right. And I think that's a really interesting way of framing it. Like, we love in the evidence-based community to be like, yeah, well, maybe you got better despite what you were doing. But in the end, the only thing we have once we step outside of the lab and we can't deal with causation, like you said, in the IPF, it's like the proving ground, it's the testing grounds. All we can do is put together a plan, and it either worked or it didn't. And at a certain point, especially when you're dealing with high-level athletes who are near their genetic ceiling, who are pushing the limits of what they can do, if you keep getting better, that's the best you can know. And there is nothing, like you can't sit there and go, yeah, well, what if we had your twin in a different reality in the multiverse who tried something else? That could have been better. Sure, it could have been, but we can't know that. So that's where you have a better probability of doing a more optimal or closer to optimal approach if you take that baton handoff from the big picture science stuff, and then you have these high quality observations where you are actually having metrics to change. You do have some ability to account for all these individual differences, and that's where hopefully you're going to be able to push your individual towards the higher end of what they can accomplish in the given time frame you're working with. So I think I've done a pretty good job of kind of narrowing the frame of what we're talking about, letting people know that science is not just useless stuff to know about the mean. And in fact, it does totally reframe because, like you said, we've been for years in the fitness community. We had entire groups, systems, ideologies, and people operating in the completely wrong ballpark, focusing on the wrong variables, not real. And that still happens today. If you step outside of our cozy little corner of the fitness community, there are people who think calories are irrelevant when it comes to weight loss. There are people who think that progressive overload is not a thing for hypertrophy. So I think it's important to realize that science gets us into the cave in the first place, to even find the direction we're trying to go. Or I guess it is the pen light is probably a more accurate way of giving that analogy. So yeah, I fully agree, Omar. And I think understanding that baton handoff to those other two table legs is a really important way of envisioning those things. So it's not thinking it's experience versus science. It's science giving the handoff to experience and individual differences so that you can actually get closer to that ideal outcome.
Eric, let's just upgrade Mike T's original analogy and say that science is the compass. So you now have more equipment. Okay, you thought you had nothing else in your pockets. You have the pen light, which is your program, which is the best practices. You have the compass, which is guiding it to let you know, it's like, that's north. It's like, do you know if north is the exit? You have no idea, but you now have some basis of comparing things. We're still lost in the dark, folks. The rocks are shifting. We're scared. Mike T just went super deep, super dark. We're still down with it. I do, Eric, want to go over a potential, let's say, example, because, people listening, it's like, okay, yeah, no, okay, I bought in. Like, this sounds great. I understand. Like, the willingness to experiment on self, and then to be able to try and either observe and see what changes there are and try and make the best choices given all the data. Here's the question then for someone that does it, because I think that is one of the roles, and you brought up Dan John, of a very good coach, is it removes some of the guesswork where it helps you recognize those patterns because they have a much larger sample size to work with. So they have maybe some of that information. They've run it through a lot of different test subjects and they've seen what happens based on the intake form, all the variables that you describe. They can help you sort out that process. And that is the role of someone that guides you. Makes a ton of sense. Let's talk about the cheapskates. Just to be listening, trying to make the most gains right here. How does one then start doing this process on themselves? Like, what does it look like? I'll give you, let's just come up with a hypothetical example. It's like someone feels, so we're in our feels right now, that for them to bench press, whatever, maybe their morphology, they're like, you know what, like it's programmed typically as the number one chest builder, but I don't really seem to get a good result if I take a look at things. I'm pretty stocky. Like I have short arms. I have a more narrow clavicle. It seems like no matter however I change my grip, everything else, it's just not working for me. I want to try something else out. So I've made the choice is like for whatever my primary push, horizontal push movement, I'm substituting out the flat bench. How does one go about this process of basically trying to customize all these variables to help improve their journey? So what would that look like for someone, once again, low to the ground, that is listening to all this stuff? And I think that's, if we're being real here, I think there's definitely a level of intellectual curiosity towards that the listeners possess here, or just just say in the so-called evidence-based community where they want to learn, they want to know. I think humans are naturally curious, but then I think the next logical step for most people, I mean, there are people, it's funny, like and I think that's a joke where they say, I actually don't even lift. I just like listening to these things. I like reading these articles. And I think, they're saying it tongue in cheek. But I think for most people, the next step is like, how does it apply to me? Like I'm looking kind of for the edge. Like I know for myself, and just bringing it up once again, how I discovered the Nux was back in 2014. I was in a big kind of, strength journey I was on, and just some of the articles and what he went over and things to reconsider. It was almost like going for that edge, if you know what I mean. I think we're just naturally curious individuals, humans, and we also want to apply things. Where it's like, oh wait, this squat tip or this bicep tip. Like I remember all the videos or all the mentors or all the individuals that had a positive impact on things where we're trying to uncover the rock. So let's say someone now they're on their own, Eric. They got the compass. It's kind of like the glass is a little bit shattered, but it's still pointing in the right direction. The pen light is wavering, and they're looking to if they get out, does that mean they accomplish their goal? Like, I don't know. I don't know what happens when you get out of the cave, but they're looking towards, achieving
the cave, Omar.
Yeah, Eric's like, oh, Omar. Just so you know, it was implied by Mike T's analogy. The cave is locked. There are no exits to this cave. I'm like, oh, oh. So
There's
what is
just,
that?
Yeah, I think, of course, the only answer is it depends, right?
Yeah. And
Podcast
we're now
finished.
45 minutes in.
Sorted.
Hey, so who do we want to thank, Eric, for this episode? We want to shout out, obviously, the Muscle Strength Pyramids. We want to shout out Mass, Monthly Application Strength Sports. That's every single month.
Big science.
Anything else? Yep.
Just big science in general, who I'm in the pocket of.
Yeah.
But I think we talked about this off air a little bit, is that saying it depends is kind of a cop-out, because of course it depends. And I got to give a big shout out to Nick Tuminello. He loves to say that it depends is a cop-out. So I'm parroting him, but when he first said this, I totally agree. And I think this actually discriminates between someone who is just aware of the science, who's just a scientist and is aware of variables, is aware of context, is a rational thinker, but doesn't have experience to give more fidelity than that, versus an experienced practitioner who is a rational person and scientifically aware, is the person who has that experience can answer that question that doesn't actually have an answer. So let me give you an example. If someone says, hey, bench press doesn't seem to build, great pecs for me. What should I do? A scientist would be overwhelmed by all the possible reasons why that wouldn't be, and would say it depends. A trainer might look at them and think, do they have really long arms? Do they look generally like they don't have much experience training? Do they have unrealistic expectations? Have they been exposed to information that they think the bench is going to do something magical? Um, is it really the bench press problem at all? Are they not eating enough? Or are they expecting to get bigger and leaner at the same time? And which, of course, you can if you listen to the episode with Chris Barracat. But are they doing other things that might be hindering that process? So I think, you could also look at someone and say, all right, well, show me you doing the bench press. And a scientist who's read all this stuff, but is not specifically a biomechanist and who studies the bench press, won't necessarily know like what is probably better or worse bench press technique. They might be able to think, well, okay, well, I need to be doing horizontal adduction. Is that happening? But that's not necessarily a useful piece of knowledge if you don't know what that actually looks like in practice. The actual experience of lifting weights versus the knowledge of it. So, yeah, I think it depends. Should always be followed by what it depends on, and how to give someone some tools to figure that out. So that was the way you originally framed this question, which I really like. Was, well, what do we consider? What are the factors that we're thinking about? So if I had someone who was trying to bench press and it was starting to cause them problems, and they weren't seeing the outcomes they wanted, I would probably start with some trial and error that isn't loosely informed on things. So, if they have, really, really long arms, and that is a lift that just feels very tricep dominant, we could absolutely try different grip widths. We could absolutely try dumbbells, which you kind of have to bring across your chest. There's a lot of things to try. And I would want to see, are they stable? Are they doing other things proper? And what are their expectations? It would result in a lot of questions. So, but if you don't know those things, you can't even ask that question in the first place. You might have the pen light, but which way do I shine it? I've got the compass, but my pen light is not useful for me. So I think that's an important understanding, and that's a difficult one to unpack because it's always context dependent. What it depends on is situational. So, if someone was to ask me, should I be using a diet break? Well, how long have you been dieting? How lean are you? What is your goal? Are you trying to maintain this level of leanness? Or are you trying to get ready for stage and then you're going to be putting that body fat back on later? What is your relationship with food like? What is currently the likelihood that you're going to go off the diet, and what do we think the causes for that are? Those are things that you can only learn from experience, which I think is really highlights the importance of it. So I don't know if that helps to understand that paradigm. I don't know if I answered any specific questions, but I think it definitely helps people know that, if someone says it depends, there should be some follow-up there. Either you giving them more information, or them soliciting more from you, or them giving a few examples. That's why examples are so helpful, because it can start to give someone insight into your decision-making process. I think that's something we try to do a lot, I think, on here and also on the 3DMJ podcast, is we talk about coaching, because truly the reason why a lot of people struggle with these concepts is they don't understand how to make decisions. They have information, but they don't know how to connect it, piece it together, and use it in a problem-solving fashion. Like, okay, I understand all this stuff about protein. When do I change it? Why and how? And what process do I go through? So I think, to go back to that more blurry line or close association between anecdote and science that I talked about with like case studies and case series, there's a couple things they do to make themselves valid, which you absolutely can replicate as a coach or as an athlete. Is one, you need to have a metric that you're actually chasing. For hypertrophy, this is tough. You can put tape measure on different body parts. You can get quite good at it, so you can get a reasonably reliable. And there is data to suggest that a tape measure is roughly representative of changes in, say, like ultrasound-induced muscle thickness. However, what if you're gaining a lot of body fat? That tape measure might go up in certain areas, but it probably would not be reflective of those ultrasound thickness changes. Also, what's a reasonable time frame you do expect those changes over? That's a tough one. So for hypertrophy, when we're dealing with people who have gained a good chunk of their newbie gains, if you will, I'm okay with taking progress pictures every once in a while in the same lighting under similar conditions in terms of diet, time of day, et cetera, proximity from training. Um, Same meal the day prior, if it's in the morning or something like that, or a similar meal if it's later in the day, earlier. Those are great, but you have to know when to take them. And I would say probably no more than every like 2 to 3 months for someone who's reasonably advanced. It's difficult to see those day to day changes on your own. So, how do you assess that metric? You need to have some more time gap. You need to be able to look discreetly. Oh, that's what I looked like back in March, and here's what I look like now in September. And I think that gives you a good visual comparison. At that same kind of time interval, you could do some measurements. And, certain things can tell you, like the relationship between those measurements might tell you how much body fat's going on. Like if you're looking a little softer in that second picture and both your waist and your arms and your hips and your thighs went up, maybe a good chunk of that was body fat. But if, let's say, your hips and your waist didn't change much, but your thighs and your arms did, that's probably a good sign, especially if you're not looking softer and you are looking more muscular. So, first is, how do we actually measure change? Now, you're probably thinking, great, so I have to wait every 6 months to tell if what I was doing is successful? Absolutely not. If we go back to that study by Hubble, who recalls the change in hypertrophy? Oh, yes, you, TikTok crew, I heard you in my ear. You mentioned 60% was the highest rate of gains, but the mean, of course, is much lower than that. The highest for strength was 250%. So it's more than a fourfold difference in the relative changes. So hypertrophy, there are smaller changes over time compared to actual force output, peak force. And we see this as well. Like if you look at the meta-analysis by Schoenfeld, the one everyone likes to quote about 10 plus sets being where peak hypertrophy happens, the absolute effect sizes for that study are a lot lower than they are for strength. You're looking at, a moderate effect size versus a large effect size. So you can see huge changes in strength in short time periods for a novice or even recreational lifters, and they see moderate changes in hypertrophy. And that same relationship to one another is there later in a lifter's career, but it's all just kind of a lower magnitude. So that means, okay, it might take me 6 months to actually see quantitative changes on a measuring tape that shows up in pictures where I can see visible changes, but those changes in my performance do have a little more fidelity, especially when we're not talking about 1RM strength. We might be talking about, hey, is my total volume across 3 sets of 10 to 12 higher? Is my strength endurance a little better? Is my RPE on a set of 10 with 70 kilos on an overhead press slightly lower than the last time? So the performance in the course of training appropriately for hypertrophy is probably the best metric you have. So long as you don't do something like switch to training for strength and start doing a bunch of singles and artificially, quote unquote, drive your strength up in a short time period, where you could actually be getting smaller muscles while getting better at everything else that contributes to 1RM strength. So long as you're like training in the 8 to 12 rep range with, single joint, multi-joint, lifts and training like a bodybuilder probably should, which we've talked about many times on Iron Culture, you can probably guess that sustained performance improvements, not just how Wednesday went compared to last Wednesday, not just week to week, is telling you something. So that is all of a sudden, now you have an anchor. Now you know, all right, am I seeing my global performance across multiple lifts, across sets, through multiple metrics? Is that overall trending upward over, let's say, half that time period? If I was telling you to wait 6 months to look at yourself, hey, let's take a look at 3 months of training progress. String together 2 to 3 mesocycles. If you're seeing progress over that time frame, you're probably doing something right. And if you don't see the size, just wait longer. Maybe you don't have realistic expectations. So that's the first step. How do I actually see if the thing I'm trying to improve changes? And then the process that also is going to emulate some of what scientists do in these case studies is to focus on one variable at a time. So some people might go, that's way too slow. What if I'm doing a bunch of things wrong? Remember, we got that compass, right? So we know we're at least going north. And if that's the direction of the exit, sure, there might be some bends and turns. It might be a little more northwest than it is north. But hey, you're not getting further away from it going in this direction. That's science, right? So if you set yourself up with those, 2 times per week, 10 sets, 6 to 20 reps from both exercises, that's where you started, and then you started course correcting over time. It's not like you're walking in the wrong direction. While there are individual differences, we all are all human. We all are made of cells. We all operate off of the gas principle. These are commonalities between us. We're adaptive machines. So we're not going to be wholly different than one another, but the magnitudes absolutely will change. So now we know that there's not too much to fear if, let's say, you could be training at a higher frequency. You're still training at a reasonable frequency. And now you're going to focus on manipulating intensity to see if that gets you better gains. Okay, that didn't really do much. I'm going to focus on volume, or I'm going to focus on frequency, or I'm going to focus on, let me just improve my recovery. I'm going to try to sleep better. I'm going to try to eat more fruits and vegetables. I'm going to up my protein intake. I'm going to improve my protein spread. Focus on one kind of variable at a time and see if that impacts things, and keep going back to that way of measuring. And I think the most important thing, and this is something that Mike T is quite good at, is within reason, you need to be willing to challenge some of the quote unquote conventions. A great example is Jeff Alberts. He's a very attentive dude, very rational, very variable oriented, and specific in the way he thinks. You should see this guy's house, very clean, okay? You should see this guy's fingernails, super clean, all right? But interestingly enough, he, over time, has fallen on what we would probably consider a lower volume approach. He probably does maybe 5 to 10 sets per muscle group per week, depending on phase of training, whether he's dieting or not, etc. And that is something he's come by honestly. He's found that that's worked best for him. And he has clients who are doing far more than that in some cases, because that's what they respond best to. So it's certainly not just a bias that is coloring his worldview. It's something that he's experimented with and gone back to. And now, if you were really focused on the science and you're like, I'm really not comfortable with the idea of going below 10 sets per muscle group, because, that's if you're training to failure. And I know I probably shouldn't be training to failure all the time. And I know that's on mostly recreationally trainees. And we probably think that you might need to do a little more as an advanced lifter. You might not even ever try doing, say, 4 to 8 sets per week for a given muscle group. But what if that is it for you? So Mike T, with his emerging strategies approach, has been willing to challenge some of these conventions probably more than most would. And I think to do that, you do have to be pretty scientifically aware. You have to be aware of the magnitude of those differences. You have to be aware that there are big individual differences and that means aren't representative of that. If you know the full spectrum of how different people are, you can know the difference between changing direction and going the wrong way in science and simply course correcting or changing the magnitude and going, right, I know volume's important, but man, I certainly seem to overtrain every time I do what's normal, quote unquote, volume. I should try less than that. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. So I think it's very difficult to make those types of decisions if you don't have some basis of knowledge in science. And this goes back to that earlier point you made, Omar. It's like, hey, let's not throw science out. I get all your critiques, Eric, but for the listener, this isn't an attack on science. Because I think we've seen this in this modern age of fake news and kind of the death of the expert. We've retreated back to, if I can't see it, it's not real. What started as a joke about, flat earthers being like a movement, now there's a lot of people who have gone down that rabbit hole because there's no way, well, that's actually not true. It's difficult for the average person to assess whether or not they're on a globe, right? And then, of course, they get on their phone and using GPS technology, they post about how the earth is flat, which is incredibly ironic. But the point is that there are people who reject vaccinations. There are people who reject basic physics. There are people who are very easily able to reject the last 50 years, 60, 70 years of science because it's not something they can directly observe. And then they make logical errors and they believe things that are simply not true. So if you don't have that basis of science, logic can only get you so far. I don't know if people have heard of the four humors, but if you look at some of the theories that very logical people who literally created the rules of logic, if we go back to Greek philosophers and Roman philosophers, the things they came up with to explain things they could never rationally, get on without quantitative science, without actually developing the scientific method and doing scientific theory, how would we ever understand the germ theory? And that's why that was a very late thing. So we explain it as miasma. We explain it as the four humors. It's the black bile. It's the balance between them. We think, you know what? Maybe we should be leaching blood out of you. There's something bad in you. Let's get it out. Those are logical things to do with the knowledge you have and the ability to gain knowledge that we had hundreds and thousands of years ago, but they were wrong. So we can't just use logic and rational thinking. We do need a fundamental understanding of the basics of exercise science, the basics of nutrition, or the things that you're going to decide to change are going to be probably outside of that ballpark that science establishes for you.
Whew. Eric, that was something. So what you're saying, to use that, it's like, so what you're really saying here, Eric, we got some amateur epistemologists who can't even trust their own senses, trying to use exclusively their senses, and meanwhile, they don't understand their own subjective experience. Okay, that still doesn't prove to me why I was gaining weight, okay? So you were coaching me, I was going up in weight. Christopher, honestly, Bearcat vindicated me, where he said body recomp is real, and you told me, no, dude, you're clearly like it. You refuse to step on a scale, but I could tell by the photos, it's just pure fat. And see, that once again was what we're talking about, what you just said about the senses, epistemology, the sense, like you're observing, you can't kind of see what's going on, but internally, there was this fat burning machine. I was synthesizing muscle at honestly an alarming rate. Now, I will say, Eric, I would put forth, and I don't know if you agree with this, I would put forth that sometimes people are kind of looking for that proverbial shortcut where they want to know the answer, so to speak. And truly trying to progress to the highest level possible requires a level of introspection and analysis of what's going on in your own training, in your own life, that puts the onus kind of on you, where it's like, you can have that compass, you can have that pen light, you can have, yes, all these guiding kind of inferences of what you think will work for you. But unless you're taking some of that feedback, unless you're thinking about these things, then a lot of it really is guesswork. And so if you're not willing to put in that time yourself to kind of track, okay, let me see my progress. What's going on here? Okay, let me see this. What's going on here? This movement. Okay, well, I ran this block. Like, how did this block go? Let's just talk about strength. We did a 12-week block. We decided to go higher frequency. We implemented more singles. We changed a lot of variables. Cool. It's like, well, how did this go? If instead we're just trying to really reduce it down, that could be relevant for those that might be overburdened, let's say mentally. So the idea that training for them is a release. They like to progress in it, but they don't want to analyze it, pick it apart, everything that they're doing to a point where it feels more like work than anything else. So for some people that want some of those neat answers, that might make sense. But for a good chunk of people, it's like, if you're really trying to unlock your true potential, it requires more work from you than even just what's going on in the gym from a nutritional standpoint, what you're doing, the thought process that goes into things. There needs to be a thought process. So I don't know first if you would agree with that before I go on.
I would, and if I could just give one endorsement of that perspective is, I would say some of the worst anecdotes that we've seen, and this isn't a shot at this whole community, in the kind of the fitness space has come from like the enhanced anti-science community, because you're able to make the enhanced bodybuilding anti-science community. When you start to add all those things on top of one another, you have something that's allowing progress, even when maybe you're not quite backwards, but you're certainly not going in an optimal direction. And you are, like you said, an amateur epistemologist. I can never pronounce that word correctly. And you may be basing things on the wrong thing. So some of the things we talked about, like you talked about chasing the pump and exclusion to actual progressive overload, or thinking certain foods create cuts, or whatever. All those things that we kind of laugh at as bro science, and some of the most egregious examples come from that. And that's why I think strength is really awesome, because you can, say what you want about anabolic steroids. You say what you want about someone who's anti-science. If your goal is to get stronger, you're going to hit if you can use all the anabolic steroids you want in the world and do a terrible strength program and violate everything we know about it, and you're not going to get much stronger. You'll hit a plateau real early. And this is why I think viewing it as like an enhanced powerlifter just means they might get to a higher level, But if they are not progressing, if they're not getting stronger, they're going to make a different decision. So there is some way to check it. Like when you have no way of validating your rationalizations in your worldview, it's easy to maintain an incorrect belief. And I think what happens to most people, if their goal is strength, even if they're anti-science, is they eventually get to a point where they don't know what to do. They can't progress, and they either decide, like you said, this takes more investment than I'm willing. I'm not a world-class strength athlete. I'm not trying to become a world-class strength athlete. Or they have to decide, I've reached my ceiling. And we don't know which one is true. Well, sorry, we don't know if you've actually reached your ceiling, but you've reached your point where you're out of ideas. So I think that's really interesting, because it's when, like, that I guess the take home there is that when you have an objective metric that you can use to gauge progress, you eventually are forced to accept truth and accept the reality. And I think that's some of the things that I love about the powerlifting world, Olympic weightlifting world, the sporting world in general. And I think it's a really useful lens for bodybuilders to look through. And that's some of the reason why I think 3DMJ has been successful, is we're not all about powerlifting or blending the two. I think we were perceived that way early on because we did emphasize periodization, use of compound movements, progressive overload, proper form, not like turning your feet in on a leg press to feel something more in your VMO or whatever. We got outside of the kind of normal ways of looking at exercise selection. We borrowed a lot of concepts from strength athletes because progress is built in. The idea of always knowing whether you're better this season than last is something that wouldn't require you to get all the way till you're on stage, And if you look at some of the things that came from bodybuilding when we weren't focused on that, it was not uncommon at all. I'm talking like mid 2000s to see the dreamer bulks happen and people just to be completely caught in their own delusions. I remember natural bodybuilders who believed, hey, look, for us to get as big as we possibly can, we just have to gain more weight. You got to convert that fat tissue into muscle. You just got to get even bigger. Like, really, honestly, I lift weights. I'm not fat. And that's what everyone's thinking when they're reading your post. I'm 250. How could my stage weight be anything less than 220 at the smallest, And people go through this dieting process and they think, oh, I went from 250, I got on stage at 180. I must have lost a lot of muscle. No, dude, you were not gaining muscle during your bulk. But the problem is that feedback is so delayed. If you spend 2 years putting on an extra 30 pounds of body fat that did nothing for you and maybe even hindered your progress, then you have to diet all of that off and get on stage. And then if you didn't diet all of it off, you're like, oh, I was big, but I didn't come in lean enough. And you think that was because you didn't cut your water. I have literally seen athletes go through 10 years of not making progress in bodybuilding and not know why and be chasing the wrong things. I was holding water. I didn't, I lost muscle during my cut. I didn't get big enough in the off season. And when really all of it's false. And you cover that up with drugs and it's another level. So anyway, to say that, yes, I do agree with you. And I think strength is a really useful way because you either squatted more or you didn't.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we want, Eric, those neat little narratives. It's like, no, my way is working. And when you have to face, as you said, that objective reality, it's like, okay, the barbell, as Henry Rollins said, doesn't lie, or strength, so to speak, doesn't lie, where this is an objective number. As long as we're doing it under the same circumstances, the same scenario, the same variables, same depth, so to speak. It's like, if you made progress, that is progress. And I think, we're cautious here with the recommendations, but also I would say optimistic. Whereas sometimes once again, as you said, Eric, if someone says it depends, well, it depends on what. And so to avoid giving, sweeping generalizations, I think that level of introspection and analysis by the individual is always warranted. But just to give 2 examples, I'll give the first example of myself of something that I personally experimented with to see what worked. And I do like what you said about Dan John. It's like, if it works, it means I'm right, like, as a coach.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember after you released that article and you guys were talking about the change to the so-called physique paradigm, or the idea of diet breaks. Now, last year when I started losing weight, I thought to myself, so I was just thinking in my head, I'm like, okay, so if I do this and I decide to take a diet break, I didn't take diet breaks before, it's going to extend the so-called time period of me losing weight. And that's a time period that instead I could use to, either gain muscle or get stronger. It's like, yeah, it's like, but if we want kind of the guaranteed win, so to speak, it's like, so you take an extra week off, like, so you did maintenance, the psychological reprieve that you have, and other potential variables that could be beneficial. It's okay, let's try this out. It's going to extend things basically by an extra 4 weeks. It's like, what's the opportunity cost for that? So thinking about all these things, it's like the personal experience then becomes very important, because it doesn't mean it's necessarily superior. What does that mean? How do we define superior? Is it superior for the person when it comes to compliance? Well, that could get interesting. It could be certainly the case for someone. And that's why I think overall kind of how do you say, outcome-based decision making is like, well, what happened when I did this, and what can we kind of piece this out? I try to do it. I decided it's like, I'm actually someone that from a dietary standpoint, I can adhere quite easily, because food for me, like, as kind of a motivator, it's okay. It's nothing huge. Getting shredded, that's what's up. But I cared also about my training, and I wanted to maintain the strength. And I did personally find, and this could be once again more getting in one's own head, that, oh, like when you keep going lower calorie and now you've lost 15 pounds, maintaining the strength becomes harder. Giving that 1 week reprieve, so to speak, of eating and maintenance, I thought this could help kind of the strength game out. Cool. Anyways, long story short, I'd never done it before, but the ease of the transition of kind of the transformation of losing whatever the 18 pounds over, honestly, I forget. I think it was like 14 total weeks. The ease where it didn't feel at all like I was dieting in quotations. And then also the fun in the gym that I experienced definitely outweighed, once again, the extra 3 to 4 weeks that it took me while I was eating a maintenance that, if one's trying to calculate things, oh, that's a waste. Like, why not just go all the way and like cut out the dietary breaks and go 12 weeks solid? And that's a way that I experimented on myself. And for my own personal feedback of what I prefer, it's like, now, guess what, Eric, when it's time to get shreddy in 2021, after quarantine, I definitely will be implementing again. That's something that I tried out for myself. And that's something that's easy when we talk about individual differences, where sometimes preference can be a thing, where let's talk about nutritional strategies. That's a way of kind of sorting it out, where you run almost a mini experiment on yourself, and you see what kind of you prefer. There are certain things that objectively, as you said, when it comes to strength, you'll find over time, like high frequency, like, okay, what I respond to, like when it comes to squats, like what I like to do, like the barbell position, like what is not only my preference, but what does it seems like it produces a better squat overall. And these choices happen over time, and you just have to be alert enough to and aware enough to recognize some of those patterns. So it's not like this mysterious, there's a fog all around us, Eric, like, oh, individual, what does that even mean? Like, am I a wide grip bench presser, or am I a close grip bench presser? It's like, guess what, man, you lift long enough, you pay attention close enough, within reason, and you'll start noticing some of these patterns. So it's not a cop out on our end to not say like, okay, let's go down like these 30 different things and here's what you need to look for. It's like part of the fun, honestly, is in that self experimentation that occurs, where you're kind of running yourself through different experiments to see what works, and then you start understanding yourself more. And to me, that almost becomes quite rewarding in and of itself. So trying to demystify things just for people once again looking, because I think kind of that transition, or the translation, sorry, I should say, it's like I said that in a previous episode, when people doubt if an individual these days is natural or not, a lot of times what they're kind of saying is, I don't trust this person. Like, just the way they carry themselves, the way they conduct themselves, the things that they say, their manner of speaking. Maybe there's so many different inputs that come in. It's like, I don't trust this person, so I don't know if I believe that they're natural, rather than, okay, I'm trying to actually objectively now analyze this as if that's even a thing. And so I think when people are looking, they might bring up individual differences, or they're looking at what works. They want to hear the neat answer, like, hey, Eric, for you, hey, I'm looking at you. You're a wide grip bench presser, like, done. You know what I mean? Like, there's your answer. All right, let's go on to the next one. Like, for bicep curls, yeah, you definitely more supination. Like, no, anything hammer curls, a bracket, no, that's not for you. It's like they want those neat little answers, and part of the fun comes in the discovery.
Mm-hmm. No, I think totally agree with everything you said, and I liked that you gave an example of how something depended for you. And I can also give a really good example that touches on many of the points we've made, where I was stuck in a certain paradigm that I wouldn't go outside of, that I had to experiment to go outside of, that was actually based on me becoming exposed to a few more research and then was backed up by the experience. And also, I had a lag time from being too focused on strength and also looking at bodybuilding. So, long story short, let's go back to the beginning, but that's kind of the summary. So, I was bigger on stage in '09 than I was in 2011 in terms of my upper body, and overall size was probably similar. My overall physique was maybe a little bit better in 2011. And around the time of 2009 to 2011, I had definitely become convinced that strength and progress was important for hypertrophy. But I got focused on it so much to the point that I did what I said to not do earlier in this podcast, is to start training specifically to increase your low rep range strength. And all of a sudden now you're focusing on the things that give you a bigger immediate bang for your buck, but won't capitalize long term on laying down the foundation for strength. Some of those morphological adaptations, including muscle size. And I was training like a power lifter for a couple years, and my legs seemed to respond fine. Over time, I found they require less volume to grow and to progress in strength as well. But my upper body, despite the fact that I was roughly holding on to my bench press, was shrinking. And I didn't really notice it until I'd been on stage. And I looked and I was like, man, I remember being a lot fuller in my upper body back in 2009. What was I doing differently? And I had to analyze my logbooks. And I realized I'd also been plateaued right around the 3-plate bench press for years, if I'm honest. So what I was unwilling to do, and I changed many other things. I tried doing different programming styles. I did DE days. I did ME days. I tried a West Side based approach. I started doing like bands and chains, all to try to get my bench press to go up. And when I finally tried training bench more than 2 and then even more than 3 times a week, and eventually going towards doing training every day I stepped in the gym was a bench day, and doing volume on each one of those days, and then dropping off volume on some days and doing singles, within a span of about 2 years from when I started doing that, I took my bench from 3 plates to touch and go 165, which was my best, which is 363 pounds. So my best competition bench was 325 to that point, and I did a touch and go 363. And I haven't actually, that was after my last competition in powerlifting. So it would be interesting once I get back into powerlifting and focus purely on that, if I can move my platform numbers up. But the point being is, with the lag time of seeing my physique, with the focus on strength too much without understanding it as a metric, but actually almost backwards, thinking the stronger I get, the bigger I'll be, rather than being bigger helps improve your long-term strength capacity, it became this huge time suck and waste of time. So I had to actually learn this over time, that look, if you were to look back in 2011, high frequency was considered like twice a week or more. Most people were training each muscle group or each lift 1 to 2 times per week at most. And now what changed for me was getting exposed and writing the research review that I did on bodybuilding training, and looking at the variable of frequency and seeing just how little research there was on higher frequencies. And what little research there was actually intriguing and interesting and showed promise, if anything. And now high frequency, when you say that, you get images of Jeff Nippert talking about training every day, Menno Henselman talking about doing full body each time he trains, things like that. And I've experimented with, each time I training most muscle groups, and getting better outcomes from that. Nothing drastic, but certainly for that specific movement, my bench press, and for my upper body muscle size, a higher frequency and a higher volume per session was the key. But I would have never known if I'd stayed in the paradigm of the traditional upper lower or the DEME, where you would at most train each lift twice per week. It just was not that. I was outside of what was considered quote unquote normal, and even up to a high volume or high frequency for that lift and my upper body in that era of say the mid 2000s to early 2010s. So I think that's an example where my rigidness and my I guess fear of missing out, or fear of doing things quote unquote non-suboptimally. Like, you can't train bench press more than 2, maybe 3 times a week. Like, that's not allowed. Why not?
You won't recover.
I don't know. Exactly. With no evidence to really prove that, but that was something that we all believed. So I think that's a great example to kind of show that things do depend. I did have some individual differences and needs there, and I had done a lot of experimentation up to that point. Accommodating resistance didn't fix it. Um, you know, Different types of programming didn't fix it. Different lengths of mesocycles, different rep ranges didn't fix it. I just simply needed to train with a higher volume and a higher frequency in that case. But I have found those things I did try for other lifts and other movements and other times that were successful.
Benching every day. That's the dream right there, Eric. That's, you know, that I was just thinking in my head, like, okay, so Monday I go in, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. That sounds like a good workout every single time. Because let's be honest, like, the deadlift, whatever. Sure, I did 600 pounds. That's for the clout game. Okay. When I touch the bar, I'm like, "Ugh." Squat, same idea. I'm like, this feels fine. When I get that bar in my hand and I'm bench pressing, all I can think about is pumping iron. I'm just rep after rep, ginormous pecs, big paychecks. Um, I will say that it is, to your point, that must have been also fun for you to go through that process of kind of deciding, like, kind of east of Eden, so to speak, where you think to yourself, oh, wait a second, like they say 1 to 2 times a week. Let me just try 3 times a week, 4 times a week, 5 times. Things are actually happening for myself. And what you said too, real quick, that it depends upon also what movement we're talking about, where it's not necessarily this global thing. Like, oh, I do the bench press 5 times a week. That's the best for me. It's like probably for squats 5 times a week. I think I told you this. Just speaking of the old like the OGs in the game, where Westside, and this isn't a knock against Westside. The person I was training with, Westside certified, so I was following like Westside to a T. I think I shared this briefly before. Bench was shooting up. I was basically just bro benching 3 times a week. High, like 6 to 8 reps, trying to get a little bit stronger. It was still just going up. Like we benched 3 plates, then it was, I don't know, like 325, 330. Things were happening without even really thinking about it. Just benching, a decent frequency. And then the deadlift, same idea. First time doing linear periodization, cool. It was the most complicated program I did, was the squat program. That's like, there's like the max effort day, the dynamic effort. Cool. Like, and again, all those things can definitely work. We're talking just in this situation here, changing how I was squatting before to like max effort. And I do think one of my hunches would be that for some people, for max effort, why it could be beneficial if you're not used to that level of arousal or getting used to really tapping into everything, where you're going, max effort. That's a different level for you that most people don't know they could unlock. For myself, I played sports. Like, I'm used to, it's like, all right, this is like game time. Like, we're sprinting here, like it's do or die. It's like, I will die before I give up on this repetition. This ain't for you, dog. And so basically we would work up to Emmy a max effort to the point where it was like a true RPE 10, where it's like a 10-second, concentric, all that stuff. Anyways, I followed it to a T. Followed the exact template, and I thought, hey, like all these guys, all these old hats, they're strong. Like, of course it's gonna work. Tested out my 1RM. Eric, it was the hardest I trained, and we trained 2 times a week the squats. It actually stagnated. It was like I tried matching it, couldn't match it, and then I thought it was the classic misgroove. That's what I was told. So I went up a little bit. No, no dice. And then, anyways, after peeling it back, taking a look at things, it's a fun process, though. I think in the quest for optimal, kind of what you said, we fear the suboptimal, right? As opposed to, it's like, this is how long is this going to take you? Okay, you've been training what, like 15 years. I've been training over a decade. These things, it's like, this is all part of learning about yourself, what you also like what you want to pursue. Like, for most of us, before we got the powerlifting itch, or even let's call it the strength itch, we probably never knew how much we are going to get into it. So before you just neatly classify for yourself, like, why would I ever bench press 4 times a week? It's like, there is some fun in that experimentation. And I think in that quest, as you said, for optimal, we can miss out on that.
No, that's really well said. And I think, I had a similar experience where high frequency, well, I always, like, I joke, like, high frequency squatting, deadlifting, Olympic lifting led me to hip surgery. But some of that was also just my hip structure, like, if you could wave a magic wand and take me back without those hip issues, I actually don't think I would have progressed, because before I had hip issues, high frequency or higher volume squatting never paid the dividends I expected. And I always did a little bit better on just like, hey, let's come back to this in a week. and let's add 5 pounds to that 3x5. And it did
Right.
pretty well, you know?
Right.
You know, it did stagnate like it always does. But when I got up to my peak, which was 495, hopefully not my highest peak ever. Once
Mhm.
I get back into powerlifting, it wasn't necessarily like a huge change in volume like it was for my bench press. It was a bit more, and there was a little more like titration of effort. Like it was like 2 or 3 times a week having an easy day that was a little more technique focused that I recover but still get some useful stuff in, and being a little more intentional in my programming. And deadlifts, man, I tell you, those I have not really hit on the answer for. I have come back from quarantine and hit a conventional PR, lifetime PR. I have done things like doing it 3 to 4 times per week and working on volume at lower loads and seeing no change at all. It just feels like it's probably for me the performance that has the most variability and the least predictability. But I often know that if I can get all my other lifts up, and if my squats are going well, and if my back movements are in place, and I just kind of let it do its things with a appropriate amount of focus of 1 to 2 times a week, it will eventually catch up. Like if that was truly a problem, I would be deadlifting more than I squat, but I don't. So I think it just goes to show you may not. I'm at the 16-year mark actually, Omar.
Ooh.
My
Ooh.
lifting just had its sweet 16. It's gonna be driving soon,
Wow.
and and I haven't figured. I don't think I have the answer for my deadlifts. Like I know what to do when it comes to benching and squatting. But for many years, it's been like, hey, I'm gonna get my bench and squat to go up, and let's hopefully my deadlift will hold steady, and that's still an increase in my total.
Yeah. And for those listening, if they were looking for the answer, we just gave it to you. It's called high frequency benching. Forget the deadlift. It's called dive
And
breaks
diet
all the
breaks.
time. Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
That's the whoosh, the thing you're not currently doing. That FOMO, the major FOMO, when you title things correctly. But I'm missing out. What's going on here? I would say for you, Eric, is there anything you want to circle back to? Because I think you covered basically how studies work and then why there can be that large difference between what someone reads. So they're thinking, well, wait a second, like here's what a study says, and then how it applies to someone, how you kind of self organize with time towards being a more competent lifter. Is there anything you want to circle back to kind of just emphasize for those looking for that one weird trick, baby?
Yeah, I would absolutely got something to circle back to, and I think it's just the practical application here is number one, become a student of the sport, whether that's getting yacked or whether that's getting strong. You need to become a basic level awareness of how adaptation occurs, what's appropriate nutrition, and what's in the realm of what we do know, big picture wise. I'm not saying you necessarily need to get a degree in kinesiology or sports nutrition. You need to have the basic understanding of some of the physiology that's involved so that you're not going to look at your compass and be like, how do I know this even works? Magnets? What? Poles? Show me where the pole is. I want to touch the pole. I don't believe in Santa Claus. Like, you don't want to be that guy or girl to where you're so science ignorant that you have the Dunning-Kruger effect, which ironically is a scientific finding. And you're like, hey, if I can't see it, it's not real. You need to have that basic understanding so you can know that north is north. From there, the next step is to figure out a way to gauge progress. And that becomes harder and harder, or at least has a longer and longer lag, the closer you get towards your genetic ceiling and the more advanced you become. And my solid recommendation is then once you've got the basic understanding, you've got a way to track progress. The third step is then be willing to get outside of the box. Be willing to do things that maybe even seem contraindicated by the means, and experiment, especially if you're stagnant. But experiment with just one thing at a time and give it a good couple mesocycles. Make sure that your metric is appropriate. If you're an intermediate or an advanced person and you're expecting to still be getting those week-to-week improvements every time that you repeat a workout, I think the problem isn't that you're not choosing the right metric or that you haven't tried the right frequency or volume or supplement or sleep or whatever or diet breaks. The problem is your expectations. So I think that's a really important one, is that you need to always be reevaluating your expectations based on where you've been and where you plan to go. And I think fitness media, I think that's not fair. I think fitness marketing and especially when people are trying to sell you something, can really do a number on people's expectations. It can make you think that everybody's making gains, and if you're not, you're doing something wrong. And by the way, buy this. So I think it's really important to not get sucked into that, and to not get sucked into social media where the cream rises to the top. Where people are all watching the 10 best lifters in the world and thinking that's the norm because you only follow 10 lifters. So yeah, I think it's more and more difficult to have realistic expectations, but more and more and more important if you want to keep making progress later in your career advancement.
Love it. Eric, I was thinking when you said that about, not comparing yourself to literally the best in the world, where the comment that I received, and I was thinking like the level of damage that this probably does to the average viewer, subscriber, whatnot, is larger than you'd think. Where someone's just saying, as an example, they're like, Omar, you would be like an 83 kg lifter. Cool. It's like, why aren't you strong as Russell? I'm like, you mean the strongest man to ever be 181 pounds in powerlifting, to out total every single other human out of the 7 billion humans, potential humans, the ones that can compete at 181 that are male. He's the best of all time. Shatter all the. Why am I not the greatest of all time? Is that the question that we're asking right now? It just provokes an interesting response. But I think, managing expectations become very important. I think for the inquiring minds, they should definitely be checking out, of course, 3D MJ, which Eric started that gangster shit along with 3 other people. And now there's a ton of people you get coaching from with 3D MJ. I think Mass, monthly application strength sports, they should check out. There's a little known thing called the muscle and strength pyramids. The muscle and strength pyramids. And then we also say there are no other pyramids. This is the first pyramid. You come at us, you come at the Kangs, you best not miss. And then lastly, we just got to thank our sponsor, the Masculinity in Crisis Tour. Our tagline is, "You're not adequate. In fact, you're inadequate, and you must find us to solve that issue." And so we're going to teach people how to out alpha everyone else in that seminar. Of course, in the presence of myself and Eric, there will be supremely beta, maybe even theta. Like there's going to be a ranking system depending upon the amount of people. And so you'll feel at the same time inadequate, grateful, but also with a level of insecurity after the seminar. They'll make you project those insecurities on others to make yourself feel superior, thereby allowing you to ascend to the alpha mindset. And I don't think I gave too much away, Eric, when I said that, but they tried with this. I don't even know what we're calling what's going on right now, but basically they try to set us back. They knew the tour was coming. You and myself were bringing the thunder, and they try to. And then
Plandemic.
Plandemic. I was going to say that. Yeah. So I'm just excited for that. There's a lot of things on the horizon for us.
Yeah, I think forget when you come to the Out Alpha tour, just forget everything we said in this episode, because we're going to give you the only metrics that matter. Our approval, and which is going to be, you'll find closely correlated, maybe even causational, with how much money you provide to the tour. And yes, like I said, or like Omar said, I should say, we're united. You are going to feel supremely inadequate as a part of this tour. You're going to be at the bottom rung. There's only 2 rungs. There's me and Omar and everybody else within the social hierarchy of the Out Alpha tour. However, there are multiple hierarchies in the world. And the top hierarchy is, of course, the alphaness hierarchy. So you're going to be, the worst of the best, but still the best, better than all the rest, except for me and Omar.
And what a place to be, right? Just think about it. We sold our soul to Paimon. We're going to be here forever. So we're basically, I don't want to say it, but we are the ones that will make all the choices for you in the future, which is why the more money you give to us, the more we see your willingness to work with us just raises you in our eyes, is all I can say. And we're starting donation. We're not going to say the figures because we rather have anonymous donors, but Eric said at the start that we're not millionaires yet from Iron Culture, and I think we could shortly fix that with the Out Alpha tour. So just be on the lookout. Everyone pay attention. Thanks for listening to the, what was it, hour and 30-minute ad before we got to the meat and potatoes, which was the tour. Appreciate everyone for always tuning in. Eric, let me ask you this, man. Where can people find You, the apex predator.
Well, I mean, what I will say is that where you find me is a non-confusing place because every social group you're in, you try to figure out, okay, what is the social currency that I need to be accepted and to rise in the ranks? Pretty straightforward. Our social currency is literally the currency of your country. They're one and the same. So social currency, monetary currency, one and the same. It's easy. You can find me hands out, expecting with a sense of entitlement and privilege, only rivaled by Omar, that you're going to put those dollar bills in my hand, and I will make you feel inadequate. But when you leave, you can carry that sense of self-loathing, and you can put it out on the world. So if that isn't a way to make the world a better place, I don't know what is.
And with that being said, I'm told by our producers, who actually are part of our TikTok crew, it's weird the crossover appeal of that.
Shout out TTC.
Whew, we should save some for the next episode because I heard a vicious rumor, and it's totally not that we couldn't get another guest, that there's going to be another duo episode. So there'll be more to talk about. I think there's a lot of nuggets of wisdom here. I think those that listen deep enough now understand donations are real. And so I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode. I want to thank Eric, my co-pilot in this journey, in this mission. I
feel like we're Stone Temple pilots right now with your background.
I feel the same way. And I could say that we were actually here before, once again, the ziggurat. And so it's getting hot here, Eric. I'm told by the officials I'm hearing right now that I'm trespassing. And I told them if it looks like I could be from the area, then I'm from the area. It's not trespassing. This is ancestral for me. Watch your mouth. But I want to just tell
everyone. You're Iraqi now, just for the time being.
Well, it's I was literally said Yaini, who is Iraqi. He said, "Look, man, if you look like you're from there, you're from the area." Like Habibi joined the crew. I'm like, all right, we'll go with it. So that's what I told them. They bought it because they did take one look. They're like, fair enough. You could, and they're like, oh, okay, like okay. So you could help us out. You could leave a rating and review on iTunes, and you can just let everyone else know. We read that review by Myron Tan. We actually enjoy reading them. If they're 5 stars, if they're 1 star, we report them, and they quickly get removed. We don't have any that are 1 star, but we could learn. And so if you leave a comment on YouTube, we'll also do our best to respond. I actually do enjoy reading them, which is why, Eric, I read that one out about apparently Sean Connery. Go figure, he sounds Scottish. He is in fact Scottish. And then someone said the Highland game scene. Who knew? Not me, apparently. You know what's funny? So, Eric, let me say this quick just before we peace out. I said constantly, not constantly, but I thought Sean, and this is me passing the buck, was Scottish. I was corrected by someone. It's like someone looked at me one time. I was like, he's Welsh. I was like, oh. He said, and that person said it with such confidence. I was like, okay. I'm like, yeah, like I don't know. He sounded like that the regional dialect there. I can't discern, like, for all intents and purposes, sure, he's Welsh. I'm like, I'm sorry. Now I'm being told I was incorrect. So don't assume. Leave a comment.
Well, it worked on me too. Like when you said it, I was like, oh, Omar must know something I don't. So.
That person's just spreading that misinformation. And we'll catch everyone every single Monday. Like just plan it from now to what? We talked about 4000 BC, 4000 AD. We will see you. We're uploading our consciousness. We'll see you in 4000 AD every single Monday. So get ready.